Imagine this. You're walking home after a long shift. It's late. The city's alive with its usual hum. Traffic grumbling, lights flickering, conversations trailing off into the wind. You're not looking for trouble. You're just trying to unwind. Then, without warning, someone stumbles into your path. A stranger, drunk, angry. His eyes lock on yours, and he spits out a sentence so vicious, so deliberately cruel, that it feels like a slap across your soul. What do? Your heart slams against your chest. Your fists clench. Your ego screams for justice, for revenge, for a moment to put this man in his place. But in that instant, something else rises inside you. Not rage, not retaliation, but a question. What if strength doesn't look like fighting back? This is the moment James faced in Central Park that night. Just another bartender, just another night. But one choice turned an ordinary encounter into something unforgettable. What happened next wasn't explosive, it wasn't dramatic, it was silent. And in that silence was power. The kind of power that Stoicism speaks of, not the power to control others, but to control yourself. James had read a line weeks before that now burned like a beacon in his mind. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In ease, that space is our power to choose our response. He didn't shout. He didn't flinch. He stood still, like a mountain unmoved by a storm. That man disappeared into the night. But James stayed there, steady, alive, free. In a world that glorifies reaction, that teaches us to fight fire with fire, this kind of restraint feels almost alien. But what if we've had it wrong all along? What if the real test of strength isn't in how loudly we roar, but in how calmly we breathe? Stoicism teaches us this, that between what happens and how we respond, there is a sacred pause. And in that pause is your power, raw, untouched, waiting to be reclaimed. We call this the 10-second ritual. Next time someone disrespects you, pause. Count to 10. Let the heat in your chest cool just long enough to make a decision that honors your future self, not your wounded pride. This isn't avoidance, it's mastery. Stillness is not weakness, it's strategy. It's a statement that says, I own myself. The ancient philosopher Theon of Athens once said, "The sea does not rise to meet every stone thrown into it." This metaphor isn't poetic fluff, it's your shield. Let others throw their stones, you remain the sea. That night, James went home and wrote it all down. Not just what happened, but how he responded and what it taught him. This is how you turn chaos into clarity. This is how you grow. And maybe you're wondering, could I really do that? Would I have the strength to pause? Stick with this story. Because what happens next in James's journey will challenge everything you've been taught about anger, pride, and the illusion of control. If you've felt disrespected lately by a stranger, a coworker, or even someone you love, then this video is for you. It's not a lecture. It's not just philosophy. It's a map back to your own power. Before we dive deeper, do one small thing that helps us keep making content like this. Hit the subscribe button. If you're here, it means you care about growth, calm, and clarity. And this channel is for you. Your support means the world and helps us create more videos rooted in ancient wisdom for modern lives. Now here's a quick challenge to get you involved. Quiz. What would you have done in James's shoes? A. Clap back and give the man a taste of his own medicine. B. Take a deep breath, walk away, and protect your peace. Drop your answer, A or B, in the comments below. I'm reading them all, and I want to hear from you. Let's build this community of modern Stoics together. There are moments in life when the noise of the outside world grows louder than your own voice. For Isabella, that moment came not in a crowded subway or during an argument, but in silence, when she stared at the glowing screen in her hand, watching a flood of cruel comments crash onto her most vulnerable video. It wasn't supposed to be like this. She had filmed it on a whim, standing at the rim of the Grand Canyon, speaking honestly about fear, purpose, and what it means to feel small in a world that demands you always be big. But the internet, unfiltered and unforgiving, twisted her authenticity into something to ridicule. They called her dramatic, attention-seeking, weak. Her first instinct was to delete everything, to disappear, to hide. But something stopped her. A voice deep inside whispered, "This is not the end. This is the mirror." That's what Stoicism teaches us, that life constantly holds up a mirror, not to judge us, but to show us what lies beneath the surface. Reflection isn't always pretty. It isn't supposed to be, but it is always revealing. As she sat alone that night in her quiet lodge, the desert wind brushing against the window pane, Isabella opened her notebook. Not to write a script or sketch new content, but to ask herself the questions that mattered. What hurt me so much about their words? Was there truth buried beneath the venom? Who do I become in the face of rejection? These weren't easy questions. They weren't meant to be, but she didn't shy away, because she understood something profound. Emotional pain is information. It's data about what we value, what we fear, what we still need to heal. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "The happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts." Isabella had been letting strangers shape her inner narrative. She realized then, it wasn't their mockery that caused the most harm. It was that part of her that believed them. So she began a new ritual. Every night, under the faded stars of the Arizona sky, she would write down 3 reflections. What tested me today? How did I respond? What would I do differently if I had the wisdom of my future self? She called it her evening compass. It wasn't therapy. It wasn't content. It was a compass pointing her back to her core. There's a strange freedom in realizing you are not your reactions. That your pain, your pride, your impulse to defend, they're all transient. Beneath them is something steadier, more grounded. A self that isn't shaken by every gust of criticism. The internet didn't get softer. The comments didn't stop. But Isabella changed. Where once she would have spiraled, now she paused. Where she once saw hate, now she saw projection. Where she once collapsed inward, she expanded. This isn't about building a wall. It's about building a foundation, because self-reflection isn't retreat. It's recalibration. It's the act of looking at yourself honestly, not to find flaws, but to uncover the roots. Why do you need the validation of others? Why does criticism feel like truth? What version of you are you trying to protect? Stoicism doesn't ask you to be indifferent. It asks you to be discerning, to distinguish between what is yours to carry and what belongs to someone else, between what's worth fighting for and what's worth letting go. Isabella's story reminds us that we don't grow when things are easy. We grow when we choose to stay present in the uncomfortable, when we choose to mine meaning from pain, rather than numb it with distraction. If you've ever been misunderstood, mocked, or misjudged, you know how tempting it is to shut down. But the real work, the powerful work, is turning inward. Not to retreat, but to rise. Reflection gives you clarity. Clarity gives you strength. And strength, when it comes from within, is unshakable. So the next time life hands you a moment of disrespect, don't just react. Reflect. Open the mirror. Ask better questions. Write down your answers. And let that process become your transformation. Not all wounds are meant to be healed by others. Some were always meant to be the doorway into a stronger, clearer version of you. Aiden had always been composed, respected, and in control. Leading international projects for a San Francisco-based tech firm meant long hours, high stakes, and relentless pressure. He thrived under it. But nothing prepared him for what happened. In that conference room in Tokyo Station, it was supposed to be a routine team check-in. Yet somewhere between his careful report and his suggestion for a new workflow, his boss, visibly stressed, interrupted. Sharp, dismissive, public. In front of the entire team, he undermined Aiden's efforts with a tone that was less feedback and more humiliation. There was no room for dignity in that moment, only silence. A few people looked away. One person winced. No one said a word. Aiden did what he was trained to do. He nodded, sat down, and finished the meeting. But the minute he stepped outside, into the cold Tokyo air, his hands started shaking. It wasn't just the disrespect. It was the fact that he didn't even recognize himself in how he'd taken it. The old version of him would have reacted, maybe not publicly, but in some assertive, direct way. But something was changing. And strangely enough, it started with a passage from a worn Stoic book he carried with him on trips, a quiet anchor in the chaos of corporate life. No man does wrong willingly. It stopped him every time. He didn't know why. Maybe because it asked something radical of him, to look deeper, to consider that hurtful behavior could come from a place of suffering, not malice. And maybe, just maybe, the power he needed wasn't the power to retaliate, but the power to understand. That night, instead of replaying the scene in his head like a courtroom drama, he sat by the hotel window and began writing down everything he imagined his boss might be going through. Pressure from investors, family issues, health problems, his own fear of failure. He didn't excuse what happened, but empathy gave him context, and context diffused the poison. Empathy, as it turns out, is armor. Not the kind that hardens you, but the kind that protects your peace while keeping your heart soft. The next day, Aiden composed an email. It wasn't an attack nor an apology. It was honest, clear, and strong. He acknowledged the tension, addressed the impact of public criticism, and offered to have a private conversation. The tone was respectful, grounded, firm, the kind of communication that emerges only when ego steps aside and clarity steps forward. What Aiden discovered is something Stoicism rarely gets credit for. Empathy isn't weakness, it's wisdom. When we choose to see others not as villains, but as fellow humans with battles we cannot see, we gain the upper hand, not over them, but over ourselves. He began a new habit. He called it his walk of understanding. Each morning he took a 15-minute walk alone before checking his phone. During this time he brought to mind someone who had irritated or hurt him. He imagined their fears, their story, their hidden wounds, not to justify, but to humanize. It changed him, slowly, deeply. We often think of power as dominance, control, or being right. But what if power is presence? What if power is the ability to see someone else's pain and not make it about you? What if real strength is choosing not to take things personally, even when they feel personal? That's the secret the Stoics knew. That understanding dissolves resentment. And when resentment dissolves, what's left is freedom. Aiden didn't win an argument. He didn't embarrass his boss. But something more important happened. He didn't let the disrespect become part of his identity. He stayed in control of his narrative. If you've ever been in a moment like Aiden's, publicly dismissed, privately shattered, you know the ache. But you also know the choice, to let it define you or refine you. Empathy is not about letting others off the hook. It's about letting yourself off the hook of anger, of tension, of carrying a burden that was never yours to begin with. The next time someone lashes out, ask yourself, what storm are they walking through that I cannot see? And more importantly, is their storm worth surrendering your peace to? Sometimes the greatest act of power is not in how loudly you respond, but in how deeply you choose to understand. Venice Beach was her sanctuary, the endless sky, the rhythm of the waves, the energy of strangers passing by. It was here that Maya found her voice, not through words, but through colors. Her murals stretched across cracked walls like living emotions, raw and vulnerable. She painted because it was the only way she knew how to speak truthfully. But that morning, as she put the finishing touches on her newest piece, a swirling mix of reds, blues, and fractured gold, a voice cut through the air like a knife. This is what you call art? Looks like something a child threw together. The words hit harder than they should have. The man didn't even stop walking. He just dropped his judgment and disappeared into the crowd. But for a moment, everything inside Maya froze. It wasn't the first time she had heard something like that. And it wouldn't be the last. But that day, it landed differently. Because she wasn't just tired, she was questioning. Why did she let strangers dictate her worth? Why did her chest tighten every time someone dismissed her work? Her heart? She didn't shout back. She didn't cry. Instead, she packed up her brushes and walked home. In her small apartment, surrounded by half-finished canvases and dried paint palettes, Maya sat in silence. She stared at the ceiling, her thoughts spinning in a loop of doubt and shame. But then she remembered a line from a podcast she'd listened to the week before, a quote from the Stoic philosopher Seneca. "No person hands out their money freely, yet we hand out our time and emotions like they mean nothing." It struck her. She had been giving her emotional power away to people who hadn't earned it, letting passing opinions shake the ground beneath her. But Stoicism offered something radical, the idea that boundaries are not barriers, they are declarations of self-respect. Maya didn't need permission to draw that line. She already had it. The next day, she returned to the same wall. But before she picked up a brush, she pinned a small handwritten sign beside her mural. It read, "This space is sacred. Respect it, or keep walking." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't angry. It was honest, clear. It said, "I matter. What I create matters. And if you can't see that, at least step aside without stepping on it." That day marked a shift, not just in how she approached her art, but in how she approached people. She began holding herself to a new standard, not one of perfection or performance, but of integrity. If someone crossed a line, she spoke up. Calmly, directly, not to hurt, but to protect. This wasn't easy. Maya had spent years thinking that strength meant silence, that to be above it meant to endure disrespect without complaint. But the Stoics didn't teach passivity. They taught clarity, justice, courage. Setting boundaries is an act of love, not just for yourself, but for everyone around you. It teaches others how to treat you. It creates a space where real connection can exist, unclouded by fear or confusion. Maya began mentoring young artists in the community, teens who, like her, used art to process the chaos of life. One day, a student asked her what to do when people mocked their work. She smiled and said, "You tell them the same thing you tell yourself. This work is my truth. You don't have to love it, but you do have to respect it." That kind of strength doesn't come overnight. It comes in pieces, in small acts of self-assertion, in moments where you choose not to shrink, not to apologize for existing boldly. Boundaries don't make you cold. They make you clear. They say, "I know who I am, and I will not trade that for your approval." If you've ever been in Maya's position, questioning whether your voice is too loud, your art too raw, your truth too uncomfortable, know this. You are not here to fit into someone else's idea of acceptable. You are here to stand firm in your own. The next time someone disrespects your space, your values, or your vision, take a breath. Remember that you don't need to meet their energy. You just need to hold your ground. Not with force, but with presence. And if you're not sure where to start, try saying this. "I hear you, but I won't accept being spoken to like that." Because sometimes the most powerful art isn't painted on walls. It's drawn in. The boundaries we set, in the silence we keep, and in the standards we refuse to lower. Daniel stood on the edge of a stone terrace in Machu Picchu, the Andes rising around him like ancient sentinels. The sun had just started to slip behind the jagged peaks, casting gold over ruins that had stood for centuries. But what Daniel carried in his chest felt older still, older than any city, heavier than any stone. He had come to Peru not for the view, not for the history, but for something he couldn't name. Closure, peace, maybe even forgiveness. Not for someone else, but for himself. Years ago, in the blur of war and homecoming, Daniel had built a friendship he thought unshakable. A brother in arms, someone he trusted more than anyone, until betrayal fractured that bond with a single, quiet decision. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was a small betrayal, one made behind closed doors, but it bled into everything. The trust, the loyalty, the belief in something sacred, they evaporated. For years, he carried it like a second skin. Anger disguised itself as strength. Resentment hid in the corner of every conversation. He wore it well. Most men do. But underneath the surface, it corroded him. not because of what was done, but because of what he couldn't let go. Forgiveness had always felt like surrender, as if saying, "It's okay," when it wasn't, as if letting someone off the hook. But Stoicism challenged that idea. Forgive others not because they deserve forgiveness, but because you deserve peace. Daniel had read that line in a journal months before. He didn't know if it came from a philosopher or a poet, but it settled in his bones like a seed. The Stoics never told you to forget. They never said injustice didn't matter. What they said was this: holding on to pain doesn't protect you, it binds you. And so, here he was, thousands of miles away from the past, standing with a slip of paper in his hand. On it, he'd written everything: the betrayal, the anger, the things he wished he'd said, the silence he kept for too long. Then, slowly, he lit the corner of the paper with a match and let it burn in the mountain wind. He didn't expect tears, but they came anyway. It wasn't weakness, it was a breaking open, a releasing. Forgiveness, he realized, wasn't about absolving someone else. It was about reclaiming himself, his energy, his future. You cannot build a new life while clinging to the ruins of an old wound. In that moment, watching the last ashes spiral into the air, Daniel felt something unfamiliar. Not joy, not triumph, but weightlessness. The heaviness he'd grown used to was gone, and in its place was space. Space for healing, for hope, for freedom. Forgiveness doesn't mean justice was served. It means you choose not to let the injustice own your spirit. It means your peace is no longer conditional upon someone else's remorse. It's yours, entirely. In the days that followed, Daniel didn't tell anyone what he'd done. He didn't need to. His demeanor changed. His eyes softened. He laughed easier. For the first time in years, he felt present in his own life. Forgiveness is not a public act. It's private. It happens quietly, like roots shifting beneath the soil. No one sees it, but everything above the surface changes because of it. If you've ever carried a wound like Daniel's, you know how it marks you, how it replays in moments of silence, how it turns bitterness into habit. But you also know that at some point, the wound stops being about what was done to you and becomes about what you're still doing to yourself. You can't control what others did, but you can choose how long you let it live inside you. And if you think forgiveness means weakness, look again. It takes unimaginable strength to stop drinking the poison of anger, to stop rehearsing a conversation that will never go differently, to walk away, not to escape, but to rise. Daniel didn't erase the past. He honored it. He acknowledged the pain. Then he laid it down, like a soldier, finally setting down his weapon. And in that act, he didn't lose. He reclaimed everything: his breath, his peace, his power. So when the sun finally vanished behind the Andes that evening, and the mountain turned to shadow, Daniel stayed a moment longer, not to remember the past, but to greet the future with open hands. The wind was sharp at the summit of Grand Teton. Sophia stood still, her boots anchored into the frost-hardened earth, drone controller in hand, watching the feed as her camera soared above the mountain range. The landscape was breathtaking, endless, snow-capped ridges stretching toward the sky, far removed from the chaos of deadlines, egos, and politics. Yet her mind wasn't quiet. It was stuck on a single moment, an offhand remark made 2 days ago in a meeting that hadn't stopped echoing. "Since you're just the visuals, let someone else handle the strategy." It was delivered with a smile, a casual tone, but beneath it lay something she couldn't ignore. Dismissal. Minimization. The kind of disrespect that hides in plain sight. Not shouted, not blatant, but deeply felt. Sophia had worked hard to be more than her image. She wasn't just a face behind a camera or a curator of aesthetic. She was the architect of her ideas. But to be minimized in front of her team by a colleague she had mentored, someone she believed respected her, cut deep. Not because it was true, but because it made her question how often she'd let herself be quietly diminished just to avoid conflict. She could have sent a pointed email. She could have spoken up right then, but something held her back. Not fear, not uncertainty. Just the awareness that anger, in that moment, would only shrink her vision. So she packed her gear and drove hours into Wyoming, away from the noise. Up into the mountains, looking not for escape, but for perspective. That's what the Stoics knew long before we did. That so often our suffering isn't caused by what happens, but by how closely we zoom into it. We mistake moments for permanence. We mistake someone's opinion for the whole story. But when you rise, physically, mentally, emotionally, things that once felt enormous suddenly shrink. As her drone hovered thousands of feet above, Sophia looked at the live feed on her screen. The winding roads, the campsite where she had slept the night before, they all looked small, insignificant. And that's when it hit her. The conversation, the jab, the weight she'd been carrying for 48 hours. It was nothing more than a pinprick on a much larger canvas. She exhaled deeply, the cold air turning her breath into vapor. She realized that this is what Stoicism asks of us: to zoom out, to rise above the immediacy of our emotions and ask, will this matter in 5 years? Does this define who I am? Or is this just a shadow passing over the light? Perspective is not detachment. It's not denial. It's clarity. And clarity is power. She remembered what her grandfather used to say when she was a child and worried over something at school. You're too close to the painting. Step back if you want to see the masterpiece. Back then, she thought it was about art. Now, she knew it was about life. Sophia decided that she wouldn't respond to the comment with defensiveness. Instead, she would respond with presence. The next time her colleague made a dig, she would look him in the eye, pause, and ask, "What makes you say that?" Not to embarrass, not to retaliate, but to hold him accountable, calmly, clearly, from a place of steadiness. Because perspective doesn't just change how we see others, it changes how we see ourselves. She wasn't just the visuals, she was the visionary, and anyone who couldn't see that wasn't worth shrinking for. Later that evening, as the sun began to dip below the mountain line and her drone returned home, Sophia sat by her campfire and opened her journal. She wrote a single question at the top of the page: what am I giving too much weight to? Below it, she listed the comments, expectations, judgments that she'd been letting live rent-free in her mind. One by one, she drew a line through them. Then, in bold letters, she wrote, "My worth is not up for negotiation." This is what perspective gives you. Not just distance from pain, but direction toward peace. Not just freedom from reaction, but the power to respond with intention. If you're carrying something heavy right now, a comment, a slight, a moment that keeps replaying, ask yourself this: how high can you rise above it? What would the version of you 5 years from now say about it? Sometimes clarity isn't found by looking deeper. It's found by pulling back, taking the eagle's view, remembering that even mountains are just bumps on the earth when you look from the stars. Sophia packed up her camera, zipped her jacket, and looked out at the horizon. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone. She just needed to remember who she was, and that was more than enough. 6 lives, 6 journeys, one powerful thread. James, the bartender who chose silence over fury when provoked by a stranger in Central Park. Isabella, the vlogger who learned to face online cruelty not with retaliation, but with self-reflection. Aiden, the project manager in Tokyo who met public humiliation not with ego, but with empathy. Maya, the artist on Venice Beach who transformed mockery into a clear, confident boundary. Daniel, the soldier in Machu Picchu who laid his burden down and reclaimed his peace through forgiveness. And Sophia, the content creator in the mountains of Wyoming, who climbed high enough to see her worth from a wider, truer perspective. Each of them faced disrespect, direct, subtle, or systemic. And each of them, guided by Stoic principles, made a choice not to react from instinct, but to respond from wisdom. They didn't just survive these moments, They use them. The Stoic response to disrespect isn't passive, it's deliberate. It's not about bottling up emotions or pretending you don't care. It's about reclaiming your power, protecting your peace, and honoring your integrity. It's about knowing that your response defines you, not someone else's mistake. So what's the real lesson here? That in every moment of disrespect, there is a doorway. And through that doorway is either reaction or evolution. James evolved when he chose stillness. Isabella evolved when she chose to reflect instead of rage. Aiden evolved when he turned his attention from offense to understanding. Maya evolved when she drew a line in the sand and said, "This is who I am." Daniel evolved when he forgave and let go. Sophia evolved when she zoomed out and realized some things aren't worth her energy. These are not just stories. These are blueprints. We live in a world where disrespect is everywhere, on social media, in relationships, in the workplace. But that also means we have endless opportunities to practice discipline, compassion, clarity, and strength. Here's how you can apply this in your own life. Start small. Pause before reacting. Journal your emotional triggers. Speak clearly when a boundary is crossed. Offer empathy where judgment used to live. Forgive, not for them, but for your own peace. And always, always zoom out. Because what feels enormous in the moment often looks tiny in hindsight. The Stoics didn't teach us to be numb. They taught us to be intentional, to live with virtue, to stay grounded while everything else is spinning. That kind of power, it's rare, and it's yours, if you choose it. Now we want to hear from you. Quiz. Which principle do you find hardest to apply in your own life? A. Forgiving those who never apologize. B. Setting boundaries without guilt. Comment A or B below and tell us why. Your experience might be the insight someone else needs. And while you're here, what's your perspective? Which of these stories resonated with you the most? How have you handled disrespect in your life? We read every comment, and we'd love to hear your wisdom, your struggle, your version of strength. If this video spoke to something inside you, please hit that subscribe button. It's more than a number. It's a sign that there are people out there who still value reflection over reaction, depth over drama, peace over pride. And we promise to keep showing up for you, with stories that matter, lessons that endure, and a community that grows stronger, one Stoic moment at a time.